So thank you again, Francesco, for being with us, and well, it's all yours.
Great. So thank you very much, Julio, for this great presentation. I think the best presentation I've ever received for a seminar. And I agree, we were all very surprised that President Trump would comment on some research. So that's definitely a nice anecdote. And so the research I'm going to present today, I mean, this is joint work with Andreas Fuster, who's at the Swiss National Bank. So the disclaimer applies that these are not the views of that institution, and Michael Weber at the University of Chicago. And the starting point for this piece of work was actually a tweet and a picture that Christine Lagarde, the recent new president of the ECB, was posting a few months ago. And so the idea was that she was finally, for the first time, starting to hold the first meeting of her policy body, the ECB Governing Council. And she posted this picture on the media saying, well, she was very happy to finally hold this group. Now, many of the Twitter sort of reactions were sort of saying, well, is it really just only white men? So if you look around the table, what you see is that this is all a bunch of old white men. This seems to be the only ones that are making up this type of policy bodies. So it doesn't really look like an open discussion, as Christine Lagarde seems to suggest. And also this kind of motto, this French motto, très blanc, très vieux, très mal, which seems to be what people thought. So probably what we need in policy making, that's what the general public was saying, is a bit more diversity in the people that make it. And so this created a debate in the US and abroad regarding what is the representation of underrepresented groups and minorities in policymaking bodies. Here, for instance, this is some evidence from the Equitable Growth Group that shows that when we think about the economists at the Federal Reserve, the main monetary policy group in the US, about 300 of those are men, only about 100 of those are women, so one out of the group of 4, and only one of all of them, for instance, is a Black woman. So this created a debate on saying, should we want to have more diversity in these policymaking groups? Now, if you ask people, that's what we do in one of the experiments I will present today, and what I'm showing you in this graph, what we see is that the demand for this diversity in policymaking bodies is extremely different across different demographic groups. But here I'm showing you what are the average responses to the question that asks people, do you think we should have more diversity in the policymaking bodies? And in particular, should we have an equal representation of different underrepresented groups as they are in the regular population, also in these policy bodies? And we can see that white men respondents are extremely less favorable towards this diversity in the body relative to others. Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So one question is there evidence on basically whether, so when you take into consideration the population that qualifies for the job, does this change the view, or still is like there is underrepresentation? I'm not sure if I'm clear with the question.
Yeah, definitely. So this
I understand that this is difficult. So who qualifies? But again, exactly. I don't know if there is some back of the envelope calculation or idea about that.
Yeah, so definitely. So this is like something that is very much part of the debate right now, for instance, because it basically also opened the question on who qualifies. So what are the characteristics that make people qualify? Because that's definitely one of the points. And so, for instance, what in the US is being debated right now is to nominate a governor of the Federal Reserve who's indeed a Black woman, and who, though, at least based on what tradition in terms of customs have been the sort of degree or background of those represented in the Federal Reserve Governing Board, doesn't seem to have those type of degrees, like a PhD in economics, for instance, which typically is the requirement, or at least that informally was asked. So the answer would be, I mean, there's no systematic evidence. Potentially, if we were setting the requirements to those that have been customary proposed, I think that what you suggest might be true. So people would see that this set of overrepresentation would be lower. At the same time, the debate right now is that are these qualifications really something we have to require or not? And this seems to be harder. So that's also part of this sort of demand by some groups that there should be an equal representation based on the population, in the sense of saying, this policy body, it should be more representative of the population at large. But this question suggests exactly where our paper starts from. So we have seen this big debate in the public sphere, but the channels through which higher diversity in policymaking might be relevant for outcomes are still very elusive. So a lot of this debate seems to be basically focused on two main channels. In a sense, the first one would be an ethical concern. So we want to make sure we're not discriminating against certain people to have their voice heard in policy committees. But it's very hard to test whether this type of channel would have any effects in policymaking, and also whether this type of channel might improve or make the decision-making of these policy groups worse. We will never be able to measure that. Potentially, one of the reasons is also what Julio was hinting to. So if we have individuals that don't have what we believe is a requirement to be part of that job, should we favor democratic representation of views versus qualified representation of views? We think that these type of channels are very hard to measure and test, but one channel that we as economists can try to measure, and for which we believe we want to have this contribution in this debate, is the fact that the presence of a broader, more diverse composition of these policy bodies might make the communication of these bodies to the broader population more effective. And so why is communication more effective in these cases? As we will see later when we test different channels, potentially because individuals that are belonging to these underrepresented groups might trust the policymaking body more, and so believe on the forecasts or the policies that the policymaking body proposes more, or also because they might be more willing and more engaged in obtaining information regarding policymaking. So why is communication of this policy-making bodies so important, and especially for a central bank? So this is very important in terms of a very recent strand of research in empirical macroeconomics in particular, that is very apparent, I think, if you look at this relationship I have on top here, which is the Fisher equation that we all know, which is at the basis of macroeconomic policy making. So what's the idea here is that perceived real interest rates, which drive most of the households' economic decision making in terms of consumption and saving, are a function of nominal interest rate and the expectations that these households have of macroeconomic dimensions such as inflation. Now, in normal times, what the central bank would do is to manipulate the nominal interest rates, so to manipulate this IER, and by that, if expectations are anchored, we would expect to change perceived real rates and therefore affect the decisions making of these households. Now, at times it was said, like the ones that many Western countries have seen so far over the last few years, in which nominal interest rates are very low, they hit the so-called effective lower bound, so they cannot be capped anymore. Actually, this channel, moving the eye, doesn't exist anymore. And so the only way we have to affect perceived real interest rates is by managing households' expectations. And a lot of recent research, to which I'm also contributing, this is a bit sort of sort of citations, but it's a large body of research that shows that practically, indeed, communication of central banks, and especially of their forecasts for future expectations about macroeconomic variables, can affect the decision making at households quite dramatically if households decide to follow these forecasts that they are provided to them. So what we want to ask then in this paper is to study this very specific, and we believe more economically funded, a potential channel through which diversity in policymaking groups might affect expectations and decisions. So can higher minority representation on these policy committees actually allow certain underrepresented groups to incorporate the information they get from forecasts into their own beliefs more, and also to basically act more on these beliefs because they trust them more, or because they want to acquire more information about the economy after they see that they are also represented in these policy bodies.
Francesco?
About both reasons. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. So one question is, so does the general public, for example, knows about the, I don't know, the race composition of the board of governors, whether there are women or not? So,
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I'm not sure if Estancheva has looked at some of that, but I don't know. Do we know that?
Yeah, so that's a great point also. I mean, again, because it goes exactly to what we are doing here. Because what we find, so before, as sort of at the start of the on point of our elicitation, is that the vast majority of people in the population, whether represented, I mean, being the most represented group, which is white men, or any other minority, they all think that the vast majority of the members of these policy committees are white men. And so what we will see and what we do in the experiment, as I show you in a couple of slides, is exactly create variation in the salience with which people know that the composition of the policy group also includes minorities or not. So I will come to that, back to that in a slide, but if you bear with me, what I want to show you here is only just before we start to think about any interventions. So would we believe that this channel I've just mentioned it to you might have any scope in the data? Well, what I'm showing you here is on the y-axis, what is the share of subjects in our own experiment before we start any type of intervention. So you can think about it as a representative population in the US. What is the share that has expectations about inflation and unemployment that are in line with those produced by the policymaking body, the FOMC, the Federal Reserve? And so what we see is that when we look at this share across different demographic groups, it actually is very different. There is a lot of heterogeneity. So the group whose expectations are the most anchored, meaning the ones that are closest to what the FOMC proposes, is actually white men, the black bar here. We can see that already whenever we look at the group of men across different ethnicities, this share drops quite dramatically, about 1/2 of that for African-American men. And also when we look at the panel of women, which is another group that is underrepresented in these groups, also the shares are substantially lower. So in a sense, I mean, we believe that at the minimum, this evidence here, which is raw data evidence, suggests that there could be a scope to potentially the channels I've suggested to you change some of these expectations. Now, if we wanted to test for these channels and predictions in the data, say you doing an ideal experiment, an ideal field experiment, what would we like to do? Well, ideally, what we would like to do is randomize the composition of these committees, and also to randomize the awareness of people about the composition of these committees. This is unfortunately something we cannot do because the political process obviously cannot be manipulated by us. And also crucially, though, we couldn't compare periods in which the committee is more or less diverse in its composition, because clearly business cycle conditions, other dimensions related to the policy environment will be different across these different periods. So what is then that we propose doing in the set of experiments I will show you? So we will run two basically lab experiments in the field. That's how we define them. So we will have a large scale US population that we recruit for our experiments through an online platform. And we will implement an information treatment experiment in this sort of group. So we will provide them with forecasts about macroeconomic dimensions that the FOMC produces. So the actual forecast the FOMC does. But then what we will do is that we will randomly vary the extent to which it is salient to these subjects, whether the FOMC includes underrepresented group in their composition or not. So by varying the salience, what I mean is that we will vary whether the forecast information that we provide to them in terms of inflation or unemployment is accompanied by some sort of pictures of the policy committee members, which are belonging to over or underrepresented groups. In particular, we will focus on 3 members of this policy group, which were exactly at the same level of seniority at the time in which the forecasts we provide were produced. Mary Daly, who's a white female member, Raphael Bostic, who's a black male member, and Thomas Barkin, who's a white male member of this committee. Now, what do we think that this change in the salience make it change exactly? I mean, as kind of Julio was asking before, the assessed probability by these subjects that there is minority representation in the FOMC or not. Because ex ante, most of these people think that there is no minority representation, similar to the picture we saw for the ECB at the very beginning. And so, you know, observing these pictures or not might change this dimension. So what is the procedure we follow for the first intervention? Well, it works in 4 different stages. In the first stage, after we recruit this population, we elicit a set of priors of these individuals regarding the important macroeconomic variables of which the Fed is responsible for, inflation and unemployment. And so we elicit these beliefs, as is common in the literature, in terms of point estimates for this first group. And also we ask basic knowledge questions about policy making, the impact of policy making, why that would be relevant or not. Now, the crucial stage is the second one we have here, which is the information experiment stage. So what we do here is that we randomize in a 2x3 factorial design, providing information about the forecasts of either inflation or unemployment. But then these forecasts are accompanied by pictures about members of this policymaking group. So let me show you exactly what that means. So we will have a control group, what we call a proper control group, that observes some information, a text that tells them about who produces forecasts and what is the policy body that produces these forecasts. And then what we believe is a neutral sort of picture in terms of under or over representation of different groups in the committee, which is the logo of the United States Federal Reserve. Now, all the subjects for all of this information, they are required to stay on the page at least for 20 seconds to make sure that they read what we give them. Now, how do this sort of experimental treatments work? Well, for each of the different groups, we will provide them with some forecasts, either about inflation or unemployment. So here you see an example of a screenshot where the forecast is about inflation. This is the actual forecast that the Fed was proposing at that point in time. And this is accompanied with this sort of picture about one of the policymakers that was part of that. So why do we design it this way? Because this is very similar to what the Fed does on their website. So in their website, actually, that people can access publicly, you do have information about the forecasts, and also you have in the same pages information about some of these members of the committee. You know, from scratch, it might seem like a bit weird to somebody, why do we have this picture next to the forecast? But it becomes quite natural if we see what is the communication strategy of the Fed in the real world, which indeed is quite similar to the screenshots. And so the screenshots would vary the demographics that we have. So another version would be providing the same exact forecast with a representative on the board who's a Black man. And the third one would be representing instead a member who's a woman. Now here I'm also showing you the second part of the 2x3 design, so also providing unemployment rate forecasts. Of course, we have like all the combinations to which people might be randomly exposed. So once we have so this is the main intervention basically. So what we do is that then we elicit posterior beliefs, so posterior expectations, and we elicit them both in terms of point estimates. Sorry, we don't elicit them post estimates, but we elicit them in terms of probability distributions. So the main reason for that is that we don't want to make it very obvious to people. We are just trying to understand what do they do before and after seeing the picture, which could create potentially some form of demand effects, which we know in this type of lab experiments in the field are a concern. And also we elicit other questions such as their trust in the Fed, their trust in the policy institutions. Finally, we elicit a set of demographic characteristics of the subjects themselves at the very end, including also some of their political views. For instance, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, whether they support the Black Lives Matter movement, which was a movement that was very strong, especially at the time we were running this survey, and so on and so forth, to allow for heterogeneity tests later. So in terms of the design, then we conducted this recruitment and the kind of survey experiment on Qualtrics, which is a large platform in the US. We targeted a bit less than 9,000 respondents, but we sort of tried to recruit more than that. So we ended up with actually more than 9,000 because of this sort of wedge in the amount of people we were trying to get. And so we also stratified the population we wanted to obtain to make sure that we have a larger representation of some of the minority groups relative to the actual population. That was based on our estimations before we ran the experiments. So we have like 30% of African American subjects. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So sorry. What is the control group? What is the control group? What are you showing to the control group? Or these are 3 treatments? One are only 3 treatments, or you have like a control?
Yes, so what we show to the control group is so a screen where they see the logo.
I saw this, yeah.
Of the US Federal Reserve, you know, which of course, I mean, by itself, one might think, for instance, when we think about minorities, or if people don't like authorities, for instance, I don't know, a minority like African Americans might react negatively to just being reminded that there is some authority above them. So what we find is that given that we have this within subject design, so we elicit the expectations both before and afterwards, so we can directly test whether any of these interventions has any effect on their expectations. So this is also why, you know, whether we fear that, you know, any of the results might be driven by the control group or not, is actually something we can test directly. And what we find is that people don't change their expectations differentially across demographic groups once they're exposed to this control information.
Yeah, because what I'm thinking is that somehow you are making believe that to people that for certain groups that they are more represented than they really are. This is not more or less the dream. So for example, in the case of the woman, so you show only a woman, so it's like you are making believe a woman that they are more represented than they really are. So why not have another, not sure if call it treatment or control, but with a picture of the whole board, so that they can see, so what is the real representation. But I don't know if this makes sense.
No, yeah, that's a great point, actually. I completely agree. So we didn't do that in a sense because we were hoping that with this treatment, we sort of maximize, I mean, that's really what we wanted to do. I mean, as you say, I mean, it's not really because of deception, but we sort of increase the extent to which people think that at least one representative of that group is there, which is the truth. So this is a representative who is there. Without necessarily making them believe that half of the board is made by African Americans or half of the board is made by women. We show them the presence of at least one of those. I completely agree with you. So it would be, and that's a great idea, and I think we can implement it also in a secondary sort of a session in which actually we show the full composition of the board, so that people understand exactly what the proportions are. And I agree with you that based on the results I will show you very soon, it might be that makes a difference in the sense of whether people interpret this as saying, you know, most of the committee is made of women, or, you know, there's only one woman across the different white men. It's definitely a very good point. So in terms of like, what do we look at like in the kind of results I want to show in the next couple of screens? Well, first of all, we look at kind of an extensive margin of the effect of these information treatments conditional on the salience of minority representation. So this means that basically we look at what is the share of respondents within each of these demographic groups whose expectations are anchored, which means whose expectations are in line with the forecast they have just read. And then we will also look at an intensive margin, which looks at the actual continuum of these priors and posteriors and how they change before and after the intervention. Now, something that I would like to stress here before showing you the results is that for this type of exercise, we don't really require people to have any kind of financial, economic literacy, or even numeracy necessarily, because we are giving them a certain forecast. So if people want and trust that forecast, they can just repeat exactly the number they've just seen. So they don't need to know anything about inflation. They don't need anything about unemployment. If the committee is really able to manage their expectations, that means that these people will leave the experiment telling us that they think unemployment will be that ratio. And otherwise not. So even if there might be differences across demographics, in literacy, in numeracy, this wouldn't necessarily matter. We also elicited some of these dimensions, and we verified that after controlling for those, these dimensions don't matter at all. So let me show you first some of the results in raw data groups. So here I'm just directly comparing also the experimental cells for what I care about. Then I will show you also results that actually look at all the data together in regressions. So here what I'm showing you in the y-axis is what is the share of women whose expectations fall into the target, into the group that FOMC gives them. So we first see what is the group for those for which we have no forecast. So they are the control group. For the ones that are seeing an unemployment forecast, but this was associated with groups that are not demographically similar to them. And then finally, those in the last group who saw the unemployment forecast, and also at the same time, this was associated with the group that was homophilic to them. So in this case, women see the woman as a member of the group. So we see that in terms of magnitude, the increase in the share of those that report this expectation similar to the group is about like 40%. Now, what happens in terms of like the heterogeneity of this intervention? Because here I'm looking at every woman. So this would be both white women who are completely similar to the person they saw in terms of the demographics, but also women of other ethnicities who instead differ, at least in terms of their ethnicity with them. And so we see that indeed all this effect is driven by white women. So when I split this in terms of heterogeneity between white women subjects, that's what really drives the whole difference in reaction to the forecast accompanied by the picture of Mary Daly. When I look at Black women, for instance, there is almost no difference across the groups. So in a sense, it seems like that for these women, it's really important not just to have one of their dimensions to be matched by the group that's represented, but all their characteristics, both in terms of gender and ethnicity. Something very similar is what we find when we look at African Americans. So here I'm looking at African American subjects, again on the y-axis, what is the share of African American subjects that report forecasts exposed in line with what they saw, based on those that saw no treatment, based on those that saw unemployment forecasts in general, and based on those that saw the unemployment forecast associated with the African American member of the board. So we see that in terms of magnitude here, the difference is very small and actually statistically insignificant across the two groups. But even here, the effect masks enormous heterogeneity. So once I split the groups of subjects between African American men, so those for which both of the characteristics are matched by the member of the board, so it's an African American and it's a man, that's exactly where we see that the reaction is substantially large. When I again look at the group of African American women that only have one of their dimensions matched, the ethnicity of the member of the board, but not the gender dimension, again, they don't seem to be reacting almost at all. Now, the second thing then we look at is what is the reaction of white men? So one of the concerns that we might have beforehand, and at least this is a concern that we had in our AEA pre-registered report in terms of potential outcomes, is that, obviously we don't only care, as unfortunately we believe somebody, on Twitter seems to say, that the underrepresented groups have expectations more in line with the committee. We also want to make sure that the overrepresented groups doesn't get disanchored in terms of their expectations, because obviously, we need to make sure, if anything, that we manage everybody's expectations better. That's also a concern in the US setting, at least, because we know, based on the data, that white men represent the majority of the wealth and the income in this economy. So disanchoring their expectations might potentially have even more negative consequences than managing the expectations of the minority groups more. So what we want to understand is, does the salience of these underrepresented in the group, individuals in the group disanchor the expectations of the minority, or the majority, or the overrepresented groups? Here again, I'm showing you on the y-axis the share of white men whose expectations are in line with the committee. And so we see that relative to the no forecast control group, so white men that are exposed to barking indeed increase are more in line with the forecast. For the other groups, if anything, we do observe slightly lower ratios, but they're economically and statistically similar to those exposed to the white group. Now here, I didn't have time for the presentation, so I don't show you those results, but they are in the paper. Even if we split these samples even more among white men who are declared that they are Republican, so they're less likely potentially to support this higher diversity, or those that explicitly tell us in the experiment at the very end they are against the Black Lives Matter movement. So if anything, they really have distaste for potentially being reminded of rights of other minority groups. We see that also for these groups the results are quite similar. There is no difference in terms of disanchoring, which at least we can say we had kind of a two-sided hypothesis when we brought this thing to the experiment. If I had to say what our prior was, is that we thought actually this would have had a disanchoring effect, but the data are pretty clear in that respect. It doesn't seem that this disanchoring comes out. Even I will show you in other results later. So I now discuss about this extensive margin. So whether your expectations are in line with the forecast or not. Of course, we can also think about an intensive margin. So even if people's expectations are still not necessarily exactly the ones the FOMC suggests, but if still we can bring them closer from a very off expectation to a bit closer to what the committee has forecasted, and so what is used for monetary policy, that could be already potentially an advantage of communication. And so here what I'm showing you is in terms of regression analysis on the right and left hand side, sorry, we have the actual numerical unemployment expectations posteriors of these people. So this is the average of the probability distribution they provide to us. And on the right hand side, we think about the different treatment groups. The omitted category here is those who are exposed to the white man, Thomas Barkin. And also we control directly for whether these people were observing one or the other of the forecasts, the unemployment or the inflation forecasts. So first of all, as we can see in these sort of maroon coefficients, just the mere fact that people observe a forecast on average for the group of reference, which is the Barkin white male group, reduces their unemployment expectations. So these people tend to have higher unemployment expectations than what the committee estimates. But also once we look at the reaction for women that are exposed to Mary Daly, or for Black men who are exposed to Bostic, we see results in line with the extensive margin I showed you earlier. Now, one result which is a bit different in this intensive margin is that here we see that Black women also marginally seem to react in terms of the intensive margin. So we saw before that Black women don't get to exactly the expectations of the forecast the committee provides to them, but still they have very high expectations before in terms of unemployment, and they reduce them a bit more if they're exposed to another woman. Not really if they're exposed to the African-American man, or at least, this change is not large enough economically for us to be able to reject the null, given the statistical power that we have in this experiment. Now, these are just kind of baseline, really data results. So what happens to these expectations? Now, what we care the most is trying to understand what are the channels that potentially might explain these reactions, because this is what then would be important for the policy side. And we have thought about studying in particular two channels. So the first one might be the trust channel. So the idea here would be that if I see that my own demographic is represented in the policymaking body, maybe I will trust this policymaking body in whatever this body tells me more. Even if I don't understand anything about economics, even if I don't really understand necessarily what these numbers mean, but I might believe what these people tell me more. Another potential channel is that maybe because I see that my group is also part of this policymaking body, I get more engaged about getting information regarding the economy, and information that could be helpful to my decision making, because that's what the body, the committee is telling me. If you get this information, you will make better informed decisions going forward. And so we think about both of these channels. The first one is the trust channel. So ex ante, we believe that this channel might have a large scope in our setting. Why? Because we find that indeed the trust of different demographic groups in the Fed as an institution is very different. So here I'm showing you responses to a 7 Likert scale question that asks people on the left whether they trust that the Fed is able to reach their objectives. So we can see that the gray histogram here refers to white men. The red histogram refers to all the other groups. We can see, I mean, obviously that this histogram is shifted to the left for the other groups. On average, there is lower trust to begin with. On the right here, I'm showing you the results for a similar 7-point Likert question that asks individuals whether they think that they trust the Fed in terms of caring about the economic well-being of all Americans. And so even here, we can see that the minority groups tend to have lower trust, even in this respect. So when on the results I will show you here in terms of graphics, we will focus on trying to then understand what is the share of each demographic group that has low trust in the Fed based on the different treatments. So these will be basically people that replied 3 or less. Yes, please.
One question is, can you, or are you able to control for the knowledge that they have about the Fed, the previous knowledge?
Yes, yeah. So
because
that's
you asked that question. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point, and we do that. So we have elicited information about the knowledge on the Fed. I think I'm showing you something like that to you later, but we asked them at the very beginning of the survey. And so what we do right now is that in some of the regression results, we do indeed add that just as a control. So a dummy for whether they answered the question about the Fed right or wrong. So I don't know if you had something in mind in terms of also heterogeneity. So how people react based on whether they already knew or not beforehand.
Yeah, I am thinking that people who has more knowledge about the Fed, perhaps they trust more, but because they have more knowledge. So I was thinking perhaps on having, I don't know, in a crude way, I don't know, the residual of a trust regression after controlling for the knowledge that they have.
Yeah.
So you have to remove the knowledge effect from the trust. But somehow, suppose that most of the difference in the distribution is because, I don't know, a white man tends to be more knowledgeable about the Fed than other people. But I don't know if this is the case or not. Perhaps there is no correlation at all.
No, and actually I have to say that's a great point, because that's exactly, I mean, as you have read this in the back of your mind, that's exactly what we have. So we do have that indeed knowledge about the Fed. So what we find is that knowledge about the Fed is substantially higher for white men, definitely. So we see lower variation, heterogeneity in knowledge about the Fed across the other groups. So all the other groups know little about the Fed similarly. Whereas we see reactions to the minority, and that's what I will show you right now, actually, which goes more hand in hand with the whomever's underrepresented group is shown. But that's definitely a great point, because yeah, it's totally true that especially for the white man group, trust and knowledge might go hand in hand. I completely agree. So what I'm showing you here, which speaks a bit to that, even if we're not directly controlling for the knowledge dimension, is so what is on the y-axis, the share of these respondents who basically has a low trust in the Fed across different groups. First, I'm looking at white male respondents to the left, and across white male respondents that are exposed to either Thomas Barkin, Bostic, or Mary Daly, who's a white woman. So we can see that for white men, the share of those who are distrusting the Fed, again, similar to what we saw before, maybe slightly increases. I mean, I'm stupid here, I don't have confidence interval bars that I should have had in these pictures, but it's, you know, economic and statistically not very large. It is larger instead for other groups. So when we look at white female respondents, so the share of women who, as we know, distrust the Fed was larger than men on average, but it is less, you know, this difference is smaller for whether women are exposed to Bostich or Mary Daly. And also when we look at Black male and Black female respondents, it seems that both of these groups seem to be less distrustful of the committee body if they observe that minorities are represented. Now, something that these results seem to suggest, then all this survives when we do regression analysis. These are economically and statistically sizable differences, as we show in the paper. I don't show the table right now for an issue of time, but something that you know, opens up in terms of channels is, are these people reacting to observing their same demographic being represented? So what we would call homophily. So I only react if I see that another person like me reacts, which is what we seem to observe in terms of the expectations before. Or is there just a general taste for diversity here? So these groups maybe, you know, if you are a white woman, if you see that any minority is more represented, even the Black men and so on and so forth, you react because you have this taste for diversity. So we see that actually this channel of the taste for diversity doesn't seem to be coming up in the data and for most of our results, because we look at also differences between, for instance, Republicans and Democrats, knowing that Democrats have a definitely larger taste for diversity in terms of policy making. In other groups, these differences don't come up to be particularly large in those settings. And so the second channel I mentioned, and also wanted to show you some results before we get out of time, is this potential information acquisition channel. If I'm exposed to, I mean, if I know that I'm represented in these bodies, I become more interested in learning about the economy and getting this information. So in order to, so do we think that this might have a bite? Again, exactly as Julio was suggesting and was answering earlier, when we ask this question about knowledge about the Fed, we find that white men are substantially more likely to answer it correctly. So more than 60% of the white men know who's setting interest rates in the US, which is this Fed committee, relative to the other groups. And the literacy across the other groups, the knowledge level seems to be similar and similarly low relative to white men. So it might be that then, you know, this channel could be a place here for both of these knowledge questions. So what we did to test for this channel is where we had a follow-up experiment. So we reconnected with about half of our respondents, or at least we targeted reconnecting about half of our respondents between 1 month and 6 weeks later, based on the time it took us to reconnect with them. We obtained a bit less than 3,000, so we obtained less than half of what we had at the very beginning. And this second experiment was run in the fall of 2021. And so the main purpose of that is to test these additional channels, this information acquisition. We also tested whether any of our effects are persistent over time, which we find they are, even if for the presentation I'm mainly focusing on this additional channel today. So how do we try to test for this endogenous acquisition of information? Well, we tell people that at some point in the experiment, they will have the chance to read an article about a policymaker who discusses the future of the economy and why this is important for households. And so what individuals have to do is that they have to choose which of two different articles about two different policymakers they want to read about. And so the options we give them is, in the first case, for the first what we call the control group, we tell them that the articles are either about the policymaker in the Congressional Budget Office, which is an institution in the US that you can think about as you know, the Ministry of the Economy that also produces forecasts for the economy, or somebody at the Federal Reserve. So this is impersonal in terms of gender or other characteristics. In the second case, we allow people to choose between two white men who are both policymakers, each of them at the two different policy offices, the Congressional Budget and the Federal Reserve Board. And finally, we give them the chance between a white man and a white woman, again, across these two different groups of institutions. So why do we have both of these institutions at the same time? Because at the time when we were running our experiment, as Julio also mentioned at the very beginning, we still had the Trump administration in place. So it could be that some of these groups differentially trust the institutions based on whether they think that this is more or less affiliated with the Republican Party, and in particular with Trump. So this is why we want also to understand if this as any bite by asking them about a committee which is part of the administration versus a committee which is independent, like the Federal Reserve Board. And so what do we find then? And what was kind of the hypothesis we wanted to test? Well, potentially that then white women might be more likely to choose the Fed article that represents the white woman, that talks about the white woman giving them advice if they believe that this information channel is relevant. Otherwise, we would find no difference across these different groups. And so here is what we find, in the data. So when we look at male respondents and we compare the share that decides to pick the article about the Fed policymaker, for those who are just given the chance of choosing between the Fed or the Congressional Budget Office, for those who have the choice between two men in the two institutions, or for those who have the choice about a woman in the institution, but the likelihood of choosing this article is more or less similar. If anything, this is a bit higher for the female policymaker, even if the difference is economically and statistically insignificant. When we look at female respondents, they seem to be substantially more likely to choose the article that will provide them with the views of another white woman that is part of the Fed relative to the articles. They provide them with the views of potentially other demographic groups. And so when we ran this, more formally in regression analysis, in this differences analysis, we see that this difference between the groups 2 and 3 is about 9 percentage points out of an average of choosing those articles of 60%. So it's a bit more than 10% somehow on the average, and statistically different from 0. Right, so what do we do then else in terms of this analysis? Like, we have a large set of robustness checks, in particular, in terms of understanding whether there is any other difference across other demographic groups, which were not the ones we targeted. So we have some results, for instance, for Hispanics, which in the paper, I didn't show you the results because I feared I wouldn't have time, but in the paper, we used some kind of a placebo group, because Hispanics are not represented in the FOMC, and at the same time, they are an underrepresented group in general. And so what we find is that these Hispanics don't react to anything, which is also a way that to us speaks to this potential for a taste for diversity channel. At least within the Hispanic population, this taste for diversity in general doesn't exist at all, because whenever they look at the picture of a white woman, an African-American man, or a white man, they don't react differently across any of these different dimensions. And also other things that we do is sort of linking the expectations to the plans in terms of future consumption, saving choices that these people might make, their marginal propensity to consume. I mean, of course, unfortunately, these dimensions is what they state in a survey. So it's not, we don't observe the actual consumption choices or the actual saving choices of these individuals in the real world exposed. So all the analysis we can do in terms of linking expectations to decision making are only limited to whatever is stated in the survey. But when we think about policy making, what policymakers aim to do is at the very minimum to manage the expectations. Then whether expectations or people don't know how to incorporate these expectations in choices would be something that is already next step for the institutions themselves. All right, so we're getting closer to the end, I think. So let me wrap up. So what we try to ask in this paper, the question we would like to ask is, would increasing the diversity of policy committees be beneficial in terms of the effectiveness of economic policy. Now, we believe that ex ante, this is a question that is really two-sided, and we don't really have a position on that, largely because, as I was mentioning earlier, it might be that higher diversity improves the anchoring of the expectations of underrepresented groups, but reduces the anchoring of the overrepresented groups. So that's what we wanted to understand in our study. What do we do and how do we try to do that? Well, we propose these lab experiments in the field that exploits the salience of the diversity in policymaking bodies, because we can randomize the composition of these bodies. What we find is that higher salience of diversity for the members of the same demographic groups increases their trust in the Fed, increases their willingness to acquire information that is more similar to the demographics, and also appears to manage their expectations. There doesn't seem to be evidence for this other potential effect I mentioned, which is this disanchoring of the overrepresented group. So we don't see that happens in the data, even for the groups that would be the most against potential increase in diversity of the policy making, such as in the case of the US Republicans and those against the BLM movement. And we believe that still, of course, there are limitations to what we are doing. So first of all, we cannot test for the effects of the representation of demographic groups that are not currently in the FOMC. As I mentioned, we cannot know if Hispanics will react more to knowing that some Hispanic person will be represented, of even other minorities, for what that matters. And also it would be important for us to largely understand a bit, so what would be the optimal degree of diversity? Similar to what Julio was asking, I believe at the very beginning, that I think is a very important point. So here we can only vary the salience of whether these people are part of the group or not, but would the composition and the proportions also matter? So would we believe, for instance, that having overrepresentation in these committees is actually bad? Or would we believe that groups will react differently if we change the composition relative to what we have right now? So now we cannot really speak to that as much, because what we can only vary is the probability that people are aware that somebody that belongs to their group is on the committee, which is obviously very different than portion of the groups in these committees. So great. So thank you all very much. I mean, unless there's other questions or comments, thank you very much for your attention and for the great points that you raised.
Thank you so much, Francesco. It's a great presentation. We learned a lot. So now I open, if we have some time for questions. Yes, for me, yeah, I like a lot when you talk about the optimal, if there is such a thing as an optimal composition, no, in terms of diversity. One of the things is, I think that could be interesting to assess whether, for example, what is the effect of telling people, for example, instead of saying, well, showing that there is a woman in the committee, but you don't know, or in the board, but you don't know how many are. For example, telling this is the only woman that is in the committee. So to somehow get a sense of whether the point is whether you are represented, I don't know, or it matters also the composition. So, for example, if you feel that there is only one woman, well, this is underrepresented in the sense that
yeah, no, definitely. And I completely agree with that. And it's something we should have definitely thought more about. In particular, also, if I think about the implications for these other potential, negative effect, in a sense, which is disanchoring the overrepresented groups. So one thing would be telling, this group of white men, there's one woman, there's one African American on the board, but still the majority is white men, relative to maybe telling them, well, now we have a committee where instead, it's 50-50 men, women, and the ethnicities are represented proportionate to the population. So I completely agree that, especially in that group, it might be that these two pieces of information have a very different effect. So they might think like, well, you know, we are still, even if we have representation of these other groups, if this representation is not very large, we still own the majority of the body, and we can still make our decisions. So this would be a bit of the difference when we think about the political econ setting, for instance, having kind of minority represented because of this, you know, right to voice. So you have a small group there, one person who brings the view of that group relative to actual having power sharing with these other groups. I think that would be a great point. So something we can do in that respect, I believe, is once what you were suggesting earlier, which I think is indeed a great point, showing them the overall composition so that people have a clear sense for the shares. So something that unfortunately we cannot do is you know, showing them a composition that is more kind of 50-50, for instance, because that in reality doesn't exist. And so maybe we could try to get to that by sort of having people read articles that suggest that, you know, there is some sort of laws discussed in Congress that want to impose actual equality in these shares, which is true because that's now some proposals that have been discussed. So maybe, you know, we could get variation in that way. So some groups read these sort of about these proposals. Other groups read other information about other proposals that have nothing to do with the demographics, and maybe we could test how that differs in terms of the effect. It's a very good point. Yeah.
Thank you.
But to follow up on that, yeah, to follow up on that, do you have any post-treatment belief measure of what they perceive as the share, as the composition? Like, because like you could do like causal mediation analysis to get at that point. No, you could say. That's
true, yeah. No, that's a great point. So, and it would have been kind of a manipulation check somehow. So having a sense.
But it's not just a manipulation. I think like it would be sure a manipulation check. But I think one thing I would have liked to know is, do the white men not react because they know more about the Fed, and they know that if they see a black picture, that doesn't mean that there is more representation necessarily. Whereas if I know less, then my priors are more moving more.
Yeah, no, definitely, that's a very good point. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it would also be consistent because I mean, and we can. So first of all, I mean, the short answer is that no. So unfortunately, we didn't ask that, which was stupid. I agree. So we cannot like do this kind of analysis directly. So I was thinking whether, you know, some of the information we do elicited about this could help, which I doubt, because so for instance, for the white men, we do elicit these other characteristics like what is your political leaning and so on and so forth. And again, even there, for instance, we find that when you look at Republicans, there's no difference in the reaction. When you look at those that hate BLM, there's no reaction, but it could still be, I mean, as you say, that these people know whatever, even if I have, I mean, if there is one African-American member, why should I care? The majority is still white men. And unfortunately, so maybe what we could do is trying to look at these results in the subsample of white men who don't get the answers about economic literacy wrong. I think that you're right. So that's, I think, the only direct thing we can at least do with existing data. So if you show us that actually you don't know what this committee is, so obviously it's impossible that you know about its composition, how do you react?
Yeah, whether they do this anchor. That's what you mean, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So whether they react, I mean, whether they get more disanchored once they see a minority that is part of that. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
I think either a null or a negative would be super interesting.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Yeah, because that's definitely also, you know, I feel like at least when we started, the thing it's more, I mean, it's not that we want to say something, you know, against what the climate suggests, but sometimes, you know, you feel like even among economists recently, you know, we are a bit too fast in sort of thinking that certain interventions are necessarily positive. They are, and we show that in the paper. but also the unintended consequences have to be understood. And so this type of analysis would literally tell us whether indeed we should be worried about any of these unintended consequences or not. So I agree, that would be very interesting.
Can you just, when it comes to improving people's expectations about inflation, unemployment, I mean, is there a large benefit to changing the beliefs of people who previously didn't know what the unemployment rate and inflation projections were? I mean, what's the social benefit of doing this for people for which, I mean, it's clear that the salience of these things is not very high for them, right? So, I mean, there's obviously things are more salient, firms that are, I don't know, engaging in more trade, they know the inflation rates more often. I mean, it's probably the true for these minority groups. I mean, what's the main benefit of fixing their expectations about inflation and
Yeah, that's a great point. And so we actually, I myself and many others, of course, I mean, we have a lot of research on that. And in particular, the fact that for these two different pieces of expectations, so you do have an important impact of manipulating unemployment expectations, because that affects individuals, people on income expectations. So what we find both in observational and experimental data is that anchoring unemployment expectations, which merely mean that most people have unemployment rate expectations that are much higher than the actual realized expectations. So bringing these unemployment expectations down substantially increases their income expectations and changes their behavior, both in the field and in experiments. So the same is not true instead for inflation expectations. So we have a large literature, I believe, also right now, and again, something that I did in other papers, where not only inflation expectations are indeed even less salient to people, but also, as you suggest, they don't really react necessarily to these inflation expectations, because they don't know how that incorporates into their decision making, especially at the time where most people have lived at times with low inflation. So it's funny that typically the counter example that people bring up is Argentina because of the higher inflation. And so, for instance, some authors at Berkeley, like Ricardo Perez Trullia, who just moved to Berkeley, so he has some work that shows that so inflation expectations are much more salient to Argentinians than US people in their daily decision making. And so managing these expectations has an effect in an Argentinian population, but not in the US population. That's what he finds in his work. What I find in my papers is that in general, manipulating inflation expectations of any population I've looked at in Europe and in the US has no effect on their decisions. But the manipulation of the unemployment ones has a large effect. That's also in part why I should have mentioned it. So why I was showing you mainly the results for unemployment expectations throughout the presentation. So the ones for inflation go hand in hand, but for those, we believe, at least based on earlier research, that as you suggest, there's not necessarily impact on their decision making. Now, even that though, I mean, and it's interesting that you bring this up because so whenever you think about with central banks and in general, all the resources that are put by policymakers in central banking, this is something that they are extremely sort of convinced. So they need to make sure that the inflation expectations of the population are anchored. That's what they think. So not only about the financial market participants, but also the broader population. And so they, probably because many of us who are, PhD economists and part of the central banks think about these traditional sort of consumption saving models. And so when you talk to many of them, it's shocking to them that you would tell them, look, I mean, whether these people have anchored inflation expectations or not has really no impact whatsoever on their choices. So yeah. I think it seems more obvious maybe for kind of more, I don't know, micro research, micro sort of flavored researchers. But this is something that, as obvious as it sounds to us, is completely disregarded by these policymakers. So I believe also showing this type of results would be just important in the sense of showing these people, that probably that's really not something we should spend so many resources on, anchoring inflation expectations.
Versus unemployment.
Versus unemployment, exactly. So we should target on the macroeconomic expectations that people can easily rely to their own, or for which they understand how this dimension would affect their own decision making through their own income, others' income, GDP, and so on, relative to inflation, which is a very unclear concept.
Sorry, on that, when you say that like there is evidence that unemployment expectations matter for behavior, like are we talking about job search or what are we talking about?
So what I'm mainly talking about, I mean, the papers I had in mind is what are actually related to consumption and saving. So what we find is that so whenever you can manage unemployment expectations to go down, so these people's own income expectations increase, and these people GDP growth expectations increase, and the consumption by these people increases. So as if there is an income effect, what we would call an income effect on these people. I mean, of course, they are not thinking in terms of a model necessarily, but so these people, once their unemployment expectations decrease, they feel like now it's a time where they can spend more relative to save. And so we found, for instance, I mean, this in a few different settings, but in particular, we were studying it in the context of periods of economic crisis like the Great Recession, where what the policymaker would want to do ideally is to convince people who are hoarding savings because they're worried about the future to spend more. So the only way you have to get out of the recession is if people start to spend. So that's something we also saw with COVID recently. So in most countries around the world, the rate of savings has increased dramatically. And these are largely precautionary savings. People are worried, they don't know what's going on. And it's been very hard instead to convince those who can spend to consume more. So we find that some forms of policies, for instance, the managed unemployment expectations are successful in having individuals that have savings spend more. So that's the outcome I was thinking of. But there's also work, I think, by some macro labor economists that show that in other contexts, such as labor search, for instance, so whenever unemployment expectations decline, people's willingness to look for jobs increases, and you know, the share of people are just disillusioned about looking for jobs, so they're not. They tell you they don't look for jobs decreases, also.
But the causal chain is not like direct here. Like, I mean, they haven't shown, like, it's not something that's been shown, because I think like it makes a lot of sense that these correlations would link up into a causal chain. But then when I think about, you know, like the ideal experiment, I'm not sure that like sort of, given how many frictions there are in terms of like whether we search for jobs and when in our life, if I think like whether like the effects would be strong enough of any sort of anchoring experiment, and you see what I'm trying to say, like.
Yeah, no, definitely, yeah. So for this other type of decisions, I mean, I can't speak more directly to the other ones in terms of like the consumption choices or so on, because there instead we actually see the actual decisions of these people in the field, in the real world. So we have data from their accounts, and so there is this kind of manipulation of expectations going on, which is an intervention we implement, and then we can see whose consumption and saving more or less. So there, it's easier for us to think about this causal channel. I mean, about like the labor search, I mean, I agree that I'm not aware, I mean, or at least the papers I'm aware of are more kind of, you know, it's all based on the surveys that the BLS and the institutions run when they want to compute an employment rate themselves. So I'm not sure that there is evidence actually that would be able to speak to the actual decisions.
Because one thing that makes me think also in terms of whether there will be empirical causal chain is, I suspect if you are thinking about looking for a job, you're probably gonna do some research about what's the unemployment rate, or at least indirectly. And then if you are not, you are not. And so you might change expectations of people that are not likely to be marginal.
Yeah. No, totally. I see that. Yeah, of course. I mean, the only expectations you care about are the ones that are actually indeed looking for the job and nobody else. I mean, I don't care if my expectations are changed, yeah, because it's not that I hope I will not have to look for a job anytime soon. No, I completely agree. That's a very good point. Yeah. So I'm not aware, honestly, in this kind of communication or manipulation of expectations literature of somebody that was actually able to look at the actual labor decisions in the field. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds promising.
Would be very interesting.
One quick question about the policy again. Aren't the unemployment projections in the US, aren't they provided by the CBO and not by the Open Market Committee?
Yeah, so both of them produce unemployment. So that's also why, so in the second experiment, we also bring up the CBO there. So they both have unemployment extension in the sense that, so what the FOMC does.
When you hear it in the news, it's always the CBO.
Yeah, I think it's typically CBO because so what happens with the CBO is that the CBO comes up only with unemployment expectations and typically in the middle of the month. And the Fed comes up with forecasts about both unemployment and inflation, given that these are the two mandates they have at the same time. So yeah, I agree. And then there's also BLS forecasts that are based actually on the last week data, so they're shorter term, that also come out over time. So in our experiment, we basically provide both. I mean, it could be that the people are definitely based on their experience in the field before entering the experiment, they are more accustomed to want to listen to the information maybe by the CBO because they hear about it in the news. So what we seem to find is that on average, there's more people that want to read the article about the Fed relative to the article about the CBO. So I don't know if that is what that tells us about the point we're making. Maybe these people actually know already what the CBO says because that's the one that they always read in the news, so they don't care. It's hard for me to say. It seems unlikely, but yeah.
Okay, so we move to the other link to have a I don't know now a 10-minute coffee and thank you again, Francesco. Great presentation and also very exciting work. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And well, so now we move to the online coffee. I think that we have 12 minutes, but I think that we will enjoy it. Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. And we invite you to join for our Friday seminar. And again, all the seminars are published the calendar at our webpage, JiLAEE.org. Okay, so thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much again. Thank you.